How in the world are you going to tell your kids and grandkids about the last 90 days 10 years from now?
Welcome to Leading Leaders Podcast. 5-minute videos, 5 days a week.
I'm J Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast. I remember breaking out the video camera and putting it up on a tripod and sitting down with my grandma, who at the time was, 82 or 83 years old, and asking her to tell me what life was like at the turn of the century. And in that arena of what we now call the Great Depression. And I remember my grandma looking at me going, "The Great Depression? What are you talking about?" And I asked her to confirm when she was born, and she told me, and I said, "Well, you would have been, 9 or 10 years old. You would have been at least aware of what was going on." And she said, "Well, I know I've read it in history books, but we lived through it and didn't know it happened." And I thought, how in the world is that possible? People were jumping off of buildings. Global economies were shifting. There was a world war that followed, and a world war that ended this cataclysmic event in our world economy called the Great Depression. How could you possibly live through that and not even know that it happened or not even be impacted by it? She said, "Look, we lived on a small farm in East Texas. We raised all of our own meat, goats and chickens and cows. We raised all of our own vegetables. About the only thing we had to go to town for was milk, and they would bring that to us once or twice a week, and that was pretty much it. Everything else, we were pretty much self-sustained. And we were so close to broke most of the time, we didn't know much. We weren't impacted by global economic shifts because we didn't have any money to be impacted." Now, think for a moment that those who graduated as seniors this year, maybe even last year, were infants, if alive at all, on 9/11. Let that settle in for a minute and then ask yourself, when these young people are our attorneys and our doctors and our city mayors and our city managers and our college professors, 5 to 10 years from now, maybe 15 years from now, when they're running for state representative or running for office of a higher power, what will they remember of 9/11? Well, they'll remember only what they're told. And that's where you come in. Because the worldview that you hold today, the way you see things today, it's based on your own experiences. But your ability to tell the story, perhaps differently from everybody else who lives in your household, perhaps different from everybody else who lives on your block or in your neighborhood or in your community, perhaps completely differently because of firsthand experiences than anybody else in the world. See, it's one thing to hear about the idea of racism from someone who's studied racism in anthropology. It's an entirely different thing to hear about racism from someone who lived through it. I've had conversations with people like Jacob Miles III and Dr. Thelma Wells and Michael Jarman, people who lived through racism of the 60s, not theoretically, but physically, practically. They were there. They were the ones told to go to the back of the bus. They can tell you what the emotions felt like when people threw bottles of urine at them. See, that's different than reading it out of a history book because they experienced it. But the minute you stop telling the stories or writing them in your journal or keeping record mentally of what it felt like when you knew that there were other American citizens being followed around by drones and told to go home and to stay in their house, people who were ticketed and fined for being outside rather than getting the fresh air and the vitamin D of the sun to be healthy, to get exercise, they were told, stay in your house where the infection rate is 80% higher. Look it up. It's in the science. How will you tell that story to your grandchildren? And will they hear the same story from every other source, from the magazines and the newspapers and the online articles and the media? We're responsible for carrying this story forward for carrying it forward true as we experienced it. I want you to understand the power of your story and the story power. Craft that story in such a way that it holds on to the authenticity, to the reality of what happened, and not just the propaganda, not just the manipulation, not just the control, but what it meant to real lives, real livelihoods, what it meant to real relationships. And I challenge you to write those things down in a book where they don't get deleted like yesterday's Twitter messages or yesterday's text messages. I challenge you to record what you're thinking and feeling now for your children and your grandchildren and days to come. I'm J Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast for Tell It Like It Is TV. Have a blessed day.
Subscribe now for our extensive video library of leadership lessons promoting faith, family, and freedom.